You, comrades. It's a pleasure to be with you online. As Kevin said, I wish we would have done it more intimately, and I could have seen you in real life. But I'm sure we will manage to have a proper discussion, also with the great technical assistance that we're getting. Um, it is very important to look at the situation in Palestine as a continued ethnic cleansing. It's not the only way, and it's not the only right way of looking at the situation today in Palestine, but it's a very useful way for both understanding the essence of the problem in Palestine and in order to get historical as well as an ideological or political context to what we are facing, and maybe also it has something that can help us to engage with the situation in a more effective and useful way. Let me first just remind us what, although I'm sure you're all familiar with the term ethnic cleansing, let me just remind us that we are talking about here a term that is recognized by international law and by political system as a crime against humanity. This is an act by which one ethnic group uses all the means at its disposal to remove another ethnic group, usually in a mixed ethnic area. And this is something that is quite typical to settler colonial movements like Zionism that emerged in Europe already in the 17th century and continued to emerge in the 18th and 19th century, by which European who left the continent for whatever reasons, maybe because they were persecuted or because they were looking for better life, have colonized someone else's land and wish to create there not just a home, but also a homeland. And in the process, in the encounter with the indigenous native population, uh, uh, implemented a project that one can call displacement and replacement, displacing the indigenous people and trying to replace them with the newcomers. Sometimes this act was a proper act of elimination, genocide, as happened in North America, Australia, and some other places. Sometimes, and quite more often, it meant cleansing of the indigenous native population. And this is what happened in Palestine. As part of our overall effort to explain to the world that these kinds of crimes had been committed in Palestine from the moment the Zionist movement arrived in Palestine and are still committed today. As part of that effort, we are confronting a wall of ignorance and disinformation and distortion that does not, in fact, allow for such a conversation to take place in mainstream media and mainstream academia, namely uh, defining the Zionist project in Palestine, whether in the past or in the present, as an ethnic cleansing operation is immediately equated with anti-Semitism, and still in many parts of mainstream academia is not allowed to be dealt with professionally or academically. But we should insist on this term because the evidence is very clear. Facts are very clear as well. And any simple analysis, both of the ideologues of the Zionist movement at the very beginning of the movement in the late 19th century, and of the action taken by the Zionist movement up to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and after the creation of the State of Israel, show clearly that there was and is an ideology of ethnic cleansing, and there was and is a policy of ethnic cleansing, namely removing by force someone because of their ethnicity and for no other reason. Let me now try and do it in a more structured chronological order so that we can see as much as we can in the time that I have how this unfolded. It is worthwhile mentioning, as Noam Chomsky does, and I think he's right, that Zionism began as a relatively benevolent movement in the mid-19th century that was seeking, like many other ideological movements among Jews, some sort of a solution for a growing anti-Semitism, especially in the former Russian Empire, or in places like Romania and Poland. And this seemed to some Jewish intellectuals and activists the idea of defining Judaism as nationalism and even looking for a place outside of Europe as the best solution for that kind of anti-Semitism. This mixture of the search for a national identity with the search for a haven, safe haven, could have led the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, of course, to many other parts of the world. And as you know from the history of Zionism, there were other destinations considered, such as Uganda, the south of Argentina, and so on. The problem was not the wish to immigrate somewhere else, but the wish to immigrate as a national group and as a settler colonial group, because in the late 19th century, colonialism still had a positive public relations, and you could definitely try and convince Britain or France or Germany that you are entitled to colonize any part of the world outside of the West, as far as your political problem was considered. And this kind of fusion of interest between European leaders, including senior politicians in Britain, who were motivated by anti-Semitism, namely by the wish not to remove the Jews from Europe, with Jewish political movement that wished to get out of Europe. This fusion of anti-Semitism and Zionism, I think, also eventually orientated the Zionist movement with the support of international community towards a non-European, non-Western destination. You can add to this, of course, the Christian Zionist impulse that was there even before the Zionist Jewish project began. Back in the early 19th century, quite a lot of evangelical theologians and politicians, whom today we would have called Christian Zionists, were also already arguing, even before the Jewish activists did, for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Quite a few of the senior British politicians and pundits were Christian Zionists, long before Jews became Zionists. And this theological addition or layer that could be added to the political and strategic policy pushed everyone who believed in a national solution for the Jewish problem, either from anti-Semitic or philo-Semitic reasons, pushed them into Palestine. The encounter of the early Zionist settlers with the local indigenous people of Palestine was not that different from the encounter of European settlers with indigenous populations in North America, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. The encounter was based on the idea that in many ways the locals are aliens who have no right to the land, and the newcomers are actually the locals, are the indigenous. In the case of Zionism, this was a particular feature of the project because of the kind of narrative that the Zionist movement had concocted, that actually these are not immigrants from Europe colonizing someone else's land, but these are actually the indigenous people of Palestine returning after 2,000 years of exile. And whoever was there when they returned is someone who usurped the land and unjustly was there. Until the 1930s, the Zionist movement, even after Britain occupied Palestine in 1918, the Zionist movement could not translate these basic impulses of what I call the project of displacement and replacement into real policies or actions on the ground. The reason being that the Zionist movement was weak. The number of Jewish settlers was not very large. Only in the 1930s, they reached 1/3 of the population. They were not very good at acquiring land, despite the fact that there were quite a few absentee landlords in Palestine. In the end of the British Mandate, the Zionist movement did not have more than 6% of the cultivated land in Palestine at its disposal. They were more effective in creating a Jewish, if one could call it Jewish, or rather Zionist, a market in the cities, namely pushing away Palestinian workers from the labor market and trying to Judaize or Zionize the labor market. But the real project of displacement and replacement or removal or ethnic cleansing, and these are all synonymous descriptions to such inhumanity. The real project could not have begun before 1948. Although I must say that a recent scholarship by demographers show that the presence of Zionist settlers on land, on near land that was owned by Palestinians for centuries, wherever there was a concentration of Zionist settlement, in some cases, whole Palestinian villages disappeared even before 1948. The numbers are not large, but it shows you that as long as such a political movement has an ideology that sees ethnic cleansing as the most important means of fulfilling its project of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, ethnic cleansing would be the inevitable outcome, either on a small scale or a large scale, even if there is no action by the settlers themselves to massively expel the indigenous native people themselves. And that's what happened between 1918 and 1948. Now, the real historical moment or the real historical opportunity for implementing the project of displacement and replacement, so typical to settler colonial movements around the world, came, of course, in 1948. It begins in February 1947, when Britain decides that, or the British cabinet decides to leave Palestine. This is a Labour government, not committed that much anymore for keeping all the empire, and did begin a process of dismantling the empire. Of course, the most important and relevant part of this disintegration of the British Empire for Palestine was the decision to leave India. By leaving India, it sort of limited the British interests after the Second World War in the Middle East to oil fields and some sort of protection of the Suez Canal, but not anymore the need to keep the whole Middle East in order to keep the connection with India. Other factors contributed to the Attlee government's decision to leave Palestine. It was a very bitter winter in 47. The Americans demanded back the loans that they gave during the Second World War. And there were other features of an economic crisis. I will not go into it, but it was very clear that Palestine was not anymore a strategic asset, that the fact that both the Palestinians and the Jewish settlers were kind of operating in an insurgent way, if you want, from a British perspective, against the presence of Britain in Palestine, meant that Britain had to keep a large force there. So there was all these factors and many others that contributed to the British decision in February 1947 to leave Palestine. At that very moment, all the abstract or more theoretical plans and ideas Zionist leaders had of how to implement the project of displacement and replacement came into the fore and were translated into a proper program of ethnic cleansing. It took a year to prepare this master plan between February 47 to February 1948. It took time to galvanize, not galvanize, rather to build the military force, because you can't forcefully remove people without military force, and to convince those who were faint-hearted among the Zionist leaders that this was the only option of creating, ironically, a Jewish democracy in Palestine after the British left, namely a country where democracy would be ensured by an exclusive Jewish demography. And for that, you needed to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible before you had your first democratic elections, which indeed took place eventually in 1949. The plan was very systematic. Once it was finalized in February and March 1948, the country was divided into areas and different brigades of the main militia of the Jewish community, the Haganah. Each had a list of neighborhoods and villages it had to occupy, destroy, and remove. After the 15th of May 1948, the mission was entrusted in the hands of the Israeli army that replaced the Haganah and the other two paramilitary groups, the Irgun and the Sterngang, and they continued the ethnic cleansing. Probably the most important first phase in the ethnic cleansing, it's important to mention, took place under British eyes, and according to international law, when Britain was still responsible for law and order in April 1948, where most of the Palestinian towns and cities were forcefully de-Arabized by the Zionist forces. And this did not only mean that the urban population lost its homes, businesses, and places, it also meant that the political, military, and economic elite of the country was removed before the rest of the countryside was attacked. It was partially successful, and by saying it was partially successful, we should remember that we're talking here in an operation that demolished half of Palestine's villages, most of its towns, expelled half of its population, and destroyed also the ecology of the country. So it was successful in that respect. It was partly successful because not all of historical Palestine fell into Zionist Israeli hands. The West Bank was kept by Jordan according to a secret agreement it had with Israel, and the Gaza Strip was left outside of the Jewish state because Israel created there a huge refugee camp, and it pushed the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the south of Palestine into that area and had no wish to control it directly. The other side, or the other aspect of incompletion of this project in 1948 was the fact that there were Palestinians who were left inside Israel because the displacement and replacement operation kind of petered out towards the end of 1948, and quite a few villages in the Galilee in particular were left intact, and that's how some Palestinians became what was called later the Palestinian minority inside Israel. But most importantly than anything else, Palestinians did resist in some places, in quite a few places actually, and this is another reason for the fact that the Palestinians remained in Palestine. And secondly, as we know, out of the refugee camps, out of the ashes of the catastrophe, or as the Palestinians call it, the Nakba, the Palestinian national movement emerged and continued the struggle, first for the return of the refugees and then for the liberation of Palestine as a whole. and as we know, this liberation movement had different phases of its development, and probably since 1982, became fragmented, focused more on the idea of an independent state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and quite a lot of its revolutionary zeal has been lost in this century. Now, the most important aspect from the international community's perspective of the ethnic cleansing operation of 1948 was the fact that it was allowed to take place without any condemnation. There were a lot of people on the ground from the international press, international organizations, diplomatic emissaries. They all reported back. It was very difficult not to see what was happening. And if you look at the inner pages of the newspapers such as the Times, the New York Times, or Newsweek, from that period, you can see reports that talk very clearly about the ethnic cleansing. But the international community decided to support this project of replacement and displacement. Displacement and replacement, believing that it would absolve Europe, and particularly the new Germany, from dealing with its so-called Jewish question or the genocide of the Jews that took place in the Second World War. And secondly, they did not regard any of the Arab national movements, including the Palestinian national movement, as movement that had an important say in the creation of a new Middle East. Both Britain and France, and later the United States, believed that outside powers, imperial powers, had more clout and had the right to determine the borders, the geopolitical map, and the fate of the people much more than the people themselves. Until in the 1950s, we saw the beginning of revolutions in the Arab world against this imperialism that in some cases ended successfully in removing the imperial influence from the Arab world. But at that particular moment, the new state of Israel that was created through this project of ethnic cleansing received international immunity from any engagement with what it had done in 1948. And it was not just the fact that nobody was brought to justice, or that this is not mentioned today. It was accepting an Israeli narrative that actually denied that Palestinians were ever ethnically cleansed. There was a kind of a fabrication developed about Palestinians voluntarily leaving Palestine, the Arab world responsible for what happened because it tried to invade the Jewish state and destroy it. All this contributed to a total denial of the ethnic cleansing, let alone the decision not to bring the criminals of 1948 to any kind of an international tribunal or to the judgment, at least of the public opinion, about this crime. The result of such an international immunity is that ethnic cleansing became part of the DNA of the Jewish state, because the state adopted Zionism as a state ideology in 1948. It was very clear that its main problem is how to complete what I call the project of displacement and replacement. Until 1967, the Zionist movement through the State of Israel controlled almost 80% of Palestine. So in geographical terms, it was a successful project, but not a complete one. Not to mention the fact that in the 20% or so that was still not under Israeli control, these 20% included sites, biblical sites, that in the eyes of the romantic nationalists of the Zionist movement were the heart of the nation, without which the nation body would not be able to operate. And there was a very important lobby inside Israel between 48 to 1967, pushing the government to militarily occupy the West Bank, less the Gaza Strip, but much more the West Bank between 48 and 67. We have now much more documentation of these preparations and lobbies, pressure on the Israeli government. Of course, when Jamal Abdel Nasser did what he did in May, June 1967, he provided the final pretext for implementing these ideas. But these ideas were there before and were nearly implemented in 1960, but in the last moment were averted. But in 1967, the historical opportunity came to take over the whole of Palestine. So this was a completion on the geographical level. But there was still a demographic issue for the displacement and replacement project of Zionism, not only because there were still Palestinians inside pre-1967 Israel, but because Israel took, with the new territory it took in 1967, it incorporated almost the same number of Palestinians it had managed to expel from Palestine in 1948. And my main claim is that from 1967 onwards until today, most of the actions taken by Israel, and in fact all the policies successive Israeli governments have pursued towards the Palestinians, are dealing with this demographic dimension of the project that I call the ethnic cleansing project, or the displacement and replacement project of the indigenous local population of Palestine. Sometimes these policies are very limited and hardly visible to anyone who is not there. They can affect the life of one family, one village, one Palestinian worker or farmer. Sometimes they are more massive and can be much more visible, but they are all part of what the Palestinians rightly call in Arabic al-Nakba al-Mustamira, the ongoing Nakba. Namely, that at the heart of these policies is a wish to deal with the conundrum as far as the Zionist movement and the state of Israel is concerned. How do we keep the whole of the territory that we coveted and we took in 1967 without deal with the demographic balance or reality which we want to change? Sometimes we can change it by force, as we did in 47. They did the same, by the way, in 1967. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly expelled from the West Bank and created a new Palestinian refugee problem. They ethnically cleansed the whole of the Golan Heights in 1967 in order to create another space for the new state without a new ethnic problem, a new demographic problem, as far as they were concerned. Now, what is quite amazing historically, and we should consider it, I think, further in our research and in our activism, is how did the successive Israeli governments, and it doesn't matter in Israel whether it's the left or the right or what is called the left Zionists or right-wing Zionists, this is a very consensual issue in Israel. You have to be an anti-Zionist in order to challenge this basic strategy and ideology and idea of the importance and the centrality of the displacement and replacement project or the ethnic cleansing project. Nobody who is a Zionist questions it. What they have are tactical debates of how best to do it and how much should it be exposed to the world and how much it shouldn't. What is amazing about the success of this project is the ability of Israel for many years to commodify this very project as a peace proposal, as if this is a rational solution for the problem. This is how quite genuine supporters of peace and reconciliation in the West see the displacement and replacement project. From the FAFO Institute for Peace in Oslo that mediated in the Oslo Accord, through kind of members of the Labour Party in Britain, or the Democratic Party in the United States, or other people who sort of see themselves as believing in a two-state solution or in peace in Israel and Palestine, they all accept the replacement and displacement as a logical, rational idea that even is fair and just on a certain level. This is how the United Nations adopted the partition plan, that at the heart, it was very clear to those who adopted it in 1947, would force Palestinians at least out of half of Palestine. This is at the heart of the idea of all the peace plans that came under the American kind of initiatives from 1967 until today, which is to divide the West Bank, and until 2005 also the Gaza Strip, into a Jewish occupied area, or a Jewish West Bank and a Palestinian West Bank, as if this is a reasonable, rational kind of idea how to settle a conflict in which both sides are equally to be blamed for its continuation. And the very idea that partition is a peace plan is the main problem with the international approach, which unfortunately also some Palestinians support, because it is not the partition which is the most important thing. Namely, it's not the space or the division of the space that really matters in a displacement and replacement project. You can still displace people even if you allegedly gave up some of the territory. And nothing exposes this paradox better than the second Oslo agreement that was signed in 1995, a peace agreement. A peace agreement that supposedly gives at least 50% of the West Bank to the direct Palestinian control. If you remember, Oslo B was divided the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. Area A under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, under the control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B joined Israeli-Palestinian control, and Area C under direct Israeli control. But the ethnic cleansing was much easier to perform under Oslo B than it was before Oslo, because under Oslo B, Area C was under total Israeli control, and since 1995 until today, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed incrementally on a daily basis without any international condemnation from Area C. Now, this is not a complete project. There are still Palestinians in Area C, but it's a consensus in Israel. And I think there will be very little condemnation in the West that the ethnic cleansing operations in Area C can continue until today. Note again, this, I will always call it a trick, although I don't think it's always intentional. Everybody was worked out in the liberal camp, in the sort of pro-peace camp, inside Israel and outside Israel, about the idea of the annexation of Area C to Israel, as if this is something that kind of kills the two-state solution. You remember the condemnation of people who are critical of the present Israeli regime under Netanyahu, and the Trump support for the annexation, and the Arab regime who are now normalizing their relationship with Israel said, we will make sure that this normalization would help us to prevent the annexation of Area C to Israel. And some of them claim that even they already did it as a precondition for the normalization. The problem is not the annexation of Area C to Israel. The problem is that all over historical Palestine, this includes Israel, will continue the displacement and replacement project, whether it has the area under direct control or whether it has the area under indirect control. There are so many means at its disposal to try and downsize the Palestinian population in historical Palestine that it doesn't have to do it always under direct rule. It can easily do it and try, at least attempt to do it, in indirect rule. And what a better and bitter example than the siege on the Gaza Strip, strangulating the whole population that can downsize the population there without occupying it, without controlling it directly. Similar impact can happen also in areas in the West Bank which are not under direct Israeli rule, and similar outcomes can already be exposed inside Israel itself, where the Judaization process of areas where the Palestinians are still have a visible presence continues to this very day. So, however, wherever you look in Greater Israel today, if you want, which is historical Palestine, and whatever Palestinian group you're interested in, whether these are the Bedouins in the Nakab, whether are the siege people of Gaza, the people who live in East Jerusalem or in the Galilee, each one of them is part of the project or is an object within the project of displacement and replacement. Their resistance, their sumud, as they say in Arabic, their steadfastness, and other factors prevent all of them from becoming such victims, of course. And the struggle continues. The popular resistance, sometimes the armed resistance, the pressure from the outside. I'm not saying that this has been completed. What I'm really talking is asking you, and I'm asking myself, how can we make sure that the major debate on what goes on in Israel and Palestine today, and what should happen in Israel and Palestine today, focuses on this issue? How do we make sure that people are knowledgeable about the past, understand the level of denial, and understand how this project is translated into reality on a daily basis today? This is important, and with this I'm reaching my conclusion. This is important on two levels. One is the level of discourse, of language. We need, many of you do, I know, but I'm talking about the general public. We need to use, of course, a different language when we talk about Palestine. We should not talk about the peace process. I don't think we should even talk about occupation or conflict. We should talk about colonization and decolonization. We should talk about ethnic cleansing and how to stop the ethnic cleansing. So there is, first of all, the issue of language that is very important, even before you are able to impose any kind of pressure on Israel to stop its destructive policies on the ground. So this, I think, relates to an immediate reaction to the criminal policy that is happening now, not to mention the need to rectify some of the evils of the past through such language and action. So that's one important. The second one is probably even more crucial, I think, in this idea, that there is too much noise around what goes on that is being kind of produced by pundits, academics, journalists, and politicians that attributes to the conflict in Palestine, as they call it, all kinds of aspects which are totally irrelevant to what goes on the ground. For instance, that this is a religious conflict, that it is a conflict between the West and the East, that it is a national conflict between two national movements. Unfortunately, the Communist Party, until recently, adopted this paradigm inside Israel. It's not a conflict between two national movements. It's not a conflict. It's occupation and colonization. And all the attempts to solve it were not a peace process. They were an attempt to find different tactics, an alternative for implementing the displacement and replacement project in terms that would be more comfortable to the international community or to the more moral section of the Jewish society inside Israel, and would also benefit Israel economically for continuing carrying out something that can be very costly. And this is policing millions of people in an undemocratic way and yet retain the title of the only democracy in the Middle East. Uh, Changing the language, knowing the history, not just of 48, but what happened from 48 until today, not being afraid to call it what it really is, and applying international law and morality and consciousness to these actions after you expose them and you call them in the right name, of course, would not liberate Palestine tomorrow. Only the Palestinian National Movement will be able to liberate Palestine if it would ever be united and not fragmented and would have a clear vision to the future. But it will create the most important conducive conditions for a successful decolonization. And let me end, because I'm a Jew who comes from Israel. I would like to end on this note. For me, always Zionism was as poisonous to the Jews as it was to the Palestinians. When I talk about decolonized and de-Zionized Palestine in the future, I also think it is for my own benefit. I'm not just thinking, and I'm thinking primarily of the Palestinians, but not only. And I think that although quite clearly some of the Zionist Jews would feel uncomfortable, and what can you do in a post-apartheid Israel, as some whites felt uncomfortable in a post-apartheid South Africa. All in all, I think for Jews, and especially Jews who came from Arab countries and Muslim countries, and decent, conscientious Jews who live in Israel, this would be some de-Zionized, decolonized Palestine is something that would also benefit them and their children and grandchildren, apart from the fact, of course, and the most important fact, that it would bring to an end the suffering of the Palestinians that has continued for too long, being victims of a project of ethnic cleansing that has never been condemned by the world, has been condoned, and in fact still denied to this very day. So we have a lot of work to do also on that aspect. So maybe I'll stop here. I think it's precisely 40 minutes, Kevin. I hope I didn't check the clock, but I have a feeling it's around 40 minutes.